This was someone who had to have a huge amount of rage to slash 4 people.
It doesn't matter how much you take Ajax or Mr. Clean and use it on your car. You can't escape these damn things.
Why would someone kill 4 innocent people? And why should I put this person to death?
DNA found on a knife sheath, a latent shoe print at the crime scene, a suspicious car repeatedly spotted circling the house, eyewitness testimony of a 21-year-old college student who came face to face with a masked killer. These are just a few pieces of evidence that prosecutors will use to string together the grisly story of the Idaho college murders. Brian Kohberger's preliminary hearing is scheduled for the end of June, and that's where he will enter a plea of guilty or not guilty to the slayings of Maddie Mogen, Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, and Kaylee Gonzalez. It's also where we will finally learn if prosecutors will seek the death penalty. Now, right now, all signs point to Kohberger pleading not guilty, which means we will be off to the races for a jury trial. So between now and then, the district attorney's office in Idaho is already crafting what they hope will be an ironclad case to put the suspected killer behind bars for good. So how will they do it? Well, I parsed this question out with a trio of experts to determine just how strong the case is against Kohberger. And let me tell you, there is a lot more than just some touch DNA. Now, even though there is a sweeping gag order limiting information about these legal proceedings, a deeper look at what we already know uncovers new information about how the state will prosecute the 28-year-old PhD student. Former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani laid out the route to conviction pretty simply: presenting hard forensic evidence that definitively connects the defendant to the crime scene is the fastest way to a guilty verdict.
What I would like if I were prosecuting this case and you're dealing with a quadruple stabbing, I would like a lot more forensic evidence.
Investigators have combed through the crime scene multiple times looking for just that kind of evidence. They've also searched Brian Kohberger's apartment, on-campus office, his car, and his parents' home. There is a seemingly endless list of potential places for forensic evidence to be lurking, and countless ways for DNA or hair or fibers to have transferred between the perpetrator and the victims. Forensics expert Joseph Scott Morgan says that blood is the richest kind of DNA evidence, and this manner of crime, this gruesome stabbing, had a lot of blood. Now, police have said it was one of the bloodiest crime scenes that they had witnessed, and they have reason to believe that when the suspect fled from the scene into his car, he was covered with cast-off or blood spatter all over him. So let's take a step back and look at this a little deeper. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Carole Lieberman notes the particularly violent nature that is a stabbing crime. And remember, this happened 4 times in quick succession.
And this was someone who had to have a huge amount of rage to slash 4 people.
But what does that rage have to do with forensics? Everything.
Every time that knife is inserted and withdrawn, you're creating more evidence all along the way. In addition to that, if he has been injured in any way, he's commingling his DNA, and I'm talking about DNA-rich evidence like blood specifically, because it is the richest source of DNA.
Is it plausible that the murderer was somehow injured during the night of the killing? Absolutely. There were 4 victims, so 4 times the opportunity for that knife to slip each time it was used, and all of those victims were stabbed multiple times. The knife would be slick with blood, the blade beginning to dull, and more force would have been needed from that killer, and by the end, the killer would have started to tire. Plus, there's this.
And this is the thing about it, Caitlyn, is the more bloodied an individual becomes, the stickier their hands become. We all know the kind of sticky nature that blood has, and it's like glue many times.
That sticky blood on the killer could pick up hairs, fibers, or even fur, which of course we know could be washed off. But it's very unlikely, even if the killer washed off himself, that he washed off the victims. Now, while 3 of them appear to have been killed while sleeping in bed, Xana Kernodle was awake, and her family said she had defensive wounds. And Morgan explains that if Xana tried to grab the weapon or the killer in any way to protect herself, some of his DNA, hair, or fibers could have ended up stuck on her through the blood. Now, whether or not any of that forensic evidence currently exists, well, that is protected by the gag order. But we actually have a handle on at least some of the other physical evidence found at the scene. The most damning piece of evidence that we currently know about is that DNA, which was found on the leather sheath of a military-style K-bar knife. Investigators discovered this crucial piece of evidence on the 3rd floor of the house next to the body of Maddie Mogen. That DNA was then matched to the suspect in 2 ways. First, through familial DNA matching to his father, and then to Brian Kohberger himself. Police records show that a cheek swab was taken from the suspect after his arrest in late December. That sample was then matched against the DNA found on the knife sheath. In court, we can expect prosecutors to put experts on the stand to talk about how the sample was discovered, how it was tested, and then to explain how the results definitively match Kohberger's DNA. Police also found a latent shoe print at the scene, believed to be from a pair of Vans. If the shoe that made the print isn't found, the size of the print can still be compared to the sneakers that police obtained off of Kohberger's feet when they arrested him. If they are both the same, a size 13, now that will definitely help bolster the state's case, but it's by no means a slam dunk. Kohberger's car, on the other hand, the now infamous white Hyundai Elantra, may be critical.
And what I think the key piece of evidence is that white Hyundai Elantra. We know that is because that's what law enforcement sort of focused on. And to the extent that any of the victims have any blood, hair, DNA in that vehicle, that's going to be very helpful for the prosecution.
When the FBI was surveilling Kohberger in Pennsylvania, they witnessed him cleaning his car, top to bottom, in the middle of the night. And you might think that could wash or clean away anything important evidence-wise, but forensics expert Joseph Scott Morgan cautions not so fast.
His car, just his car alone, is a rolling crime scene. This thing has been pretty much completely dismantled, and they are going to be using this thing bit by bit. I mean, everywhere that he made contact within that vehicle, leaving that residence that night, or in the wee hours, everything that he contacted within that residence latched onto him and transferred into that car to a great degree.
We may not know what or if crime scene techs found anything relating to the murders in that car, but we do know exactly where they are looking for it, in those small nooks and crannies that cleaning tools either can't reach or are overlooked.
So I found it one of the most telling things was the fact that they had taken off the accelerator pedal as well as the brake pedal on this car, which I found fascinating. Also the side panel, the interior of the door.
And Morgan adds that it won't be enough just to explain this to a jury or put an expert on the stand to tell them what was found. He expects the prosecution to drag the actual car parts into court for a morbid but convincing show and tell.
You're going to see that car appear physically in the courtroom, bit by bit. They will bring the seat in there, the headrest, armrest, side panel, pedals, gear lever, anything that they can where there's contact trace evidence on those surfaces.
Police say the murders took place between 4:04 and 4:20 a.m. on November 13th, and during that time frame, Kohberger's cell phone mysteriously goes off the grid. Can't pinpoint where his phone is, so you can't prove it was at the crime scene, right? Sure, but the cops said in their arrest affidavit that they believe the suspect was purposefully hiding his location, and a smart DA will use the absence of evidence as evidence. Here is what I mean by that.
Well, we know that's going to be a big theme for the prosecution, that Brian Kohberger did everything he could to cover up these crimes. We know that, on the night of the murders, that the phone either went off or it went in airplane mode. And that was a big theme for the prosecution in the original search warrant affidavit. So we know that prosecutors are going to argue that whether it's cell phone, whether it's fingerprints, or any other type of evidence that doesn't exist, it doesn't exist because Kohberger was smart, he was sophisticated, and he tried to cover up these crimes.
And let's briefly revisit that white Hyundai again. Even if, let's assume, it was clean top to bottom and not a bit of evidence was found, the prosecution may still be able to use that to their benefit to prove that the defendant worked to cover up the crimes. State officials recently revealed that at the very moment that the feds burst through his parents' home in the middle of the night to arrest him, he was doing something weird. Brian Kohberger was apparently standing in his parents' kitchen wearing rubber gloves, placing his personal trash into Ziploc baggies. Now that is not going to look good to a jury.
Maybe that's an indication that he knew that he left some of his own DNA back at the scene. Maybe he's thinking of the sheet, or maybe he's thinking of a potential injury he sustained that's going to have biological tie back. He knows he's not a forensic scientist.
Criminal defendants typically do not do this. They don't have the wherewithal. They don't have the knowledge. So what prosecutors are going to have to do is use that lack of evidence in their favor when going after Kohberger.
Remember, Brian Kohberger has a well-documented academic interest into the criminal mind. He was getting his doctorate in criminology and he has a master's in criminal justice, which makes him somewhat unique as a defendant. Motive is something everyone wants to know. Why does a killer kill? What the prosecution, though, will do with motive is tricky because it is hard to prove, and strictly speaking, they don't have to.
Prosecutors don't need motive, and every state has a jury instruction that says motive isn't an element of the crime. But jurors are ordinary people, and they're going to want to know why. Why would someone kill 4 innocent people? And why should I put this person to death? So even though jurors don't necessarily have to have motive to convict, it's much easier to get a conviction if there is motive.
Okay, so it's not necessary, but it is helpful. And in the absence of a manifesto or a confession, the state's going to have to come up with their own theory of Kohberger's alleged motive. Dr. Lieberman thinks that the motive in this case is an obvious one, and it's also one that I've considered.
You're convinced he's an incel. That was my theory too.
Incels are people or young men who grow up being rejected by women. And we know now that he was rejected by girls in his junior high school, middle school even. It started with a blonde girl who looked somewhat like Haley. They feel they're never going to get sex, they're never going to get a girlfriend, and so on.
I have long thought that Kohberger struggled with women and perhaps felt rejected by his main target in some way, probably a minor way, which ultimately triggered him. Sources previously told People magazine that he lurked around the University of Idaho campus, followed the female victims on Instagram, repeatedly messaging one of them, and had images of one of the victims on his cell phone. And cops have indicated that Kohberger was basically pacing the victim's home for months. He was spotted in the vicinity at least 12 times prior to the murders. Now, all of this can help the prosecution put together a case for motive.
To the extent that the prosecution can come forward with some stalking theory, I think that would be helpful for their case. And the cell site evidence does also show that Kohberger was at the scene of the murders the morning after the killing. So, him being there does help. Again, it's not necessary, but it's very helpful. The prosecution can come up with some sort of theory as to why Brian Kohberger did this.
Still, they need more, and we know where they are looking for it. Dozens of companies were served search warrants in the case. Banks, knife companies, eBay, Amazon, police forensics labs. But I want to focus on the ones that may help with motive. Investigators believe that Kohberger likely had collections of data on his victims, on the home where they lived, and how to kill someone, and they went in search of this digital trail in a few ways.
I'm fascinated to find out what's on that tower computer that they took out of his apartment. And my colleagues that work in electronic and digital forensics, they're salivating over this because he left a footprint. I don't. It doesn't matter how much you take Ajax or Mr. Clean and use it on your car. You can't escape these damn things.
Okay, so remember these search warrants that I just mentioned. A ton of them were for digital companies. Google, AT&T, Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, dating apps, and Reddit, and that's just to name a few. All of this information, depending on what they find, will go to motive. The prosecution will use forensic, digital, and physical evidence, along with witness testimony, to paint the jury a picture that the defendant, Bryan Kohberger, is a cold-blooded, premeditated killer. And if the jury starts to look at Kohberger as anything but, they may even call up a forensic psychiatrist to just nip that right in the bud.
You know, they're looking to try to minimize any kind of mental health issues or anything that would make the defendant seem sympathetic. So they wouldn't necessarily see the defendant for as long a period of time.
The burden of proof in a criminal case is as high as it gets. 12 jurors will need to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. And that entire burden rests in the prosecution's hands. Bryan Kohberger stands accused of 4 counts of first-degree murder and felony burglary in the gruesome stabbing deaths of these 4 innocent University of Idaho students who were just on the cusp of their young lives. If this video makes it sound like it's just an open and shut case for the prosecution, make sure you come back next week when I break down all of the different avenues for Kohberger's defense, and it might get you questioning everything.